There are many Australians now who feel shut out of the debate, who don't feel they're respected enough or respectable enough to put their views on the table or even to ask polite questions, and they therefore increasingly feel alienated and left out. Frank, welcome to this series of conversations about the big issues that are going to determine what sort of society we hand on to our kids and our grandchildren. You're an eminent intellectual from the United Kingdom. You spend quite a bit of time in Australia. You and I come from probably, in traditional terms anyway, the way they might be described, different political perspectives. And yet it seems we're in furious agreement on two things that we think would be critical to the future of our society. One is the way in which we socialise our children, the environment in which they grow up in and who accepts responsibility for it and how it's carried forward. The other is that we have to ensure that we rediscover and lock down what we once understood about a respectful public debate.
Yeah, I think that's crucially important, that the socialisation of the younger generation is the responsibility of their parents. They're the ones that are responsible for them. They're the ones that have to live with the consequences of their action. They're the ones that are intimately involved and really understand what makes their children tick. And even the most sophisticated expert with millions of PhD degrees is not really able to understand the context within which a child grows up. And what I'm really worried about is that we've tended to professionalize child rearing. We're asking experts and teachers and social workers to make judgment calls about young people. And even with the best will in the world, they basically approach young people with a pre-existing formula, template, which very often doesn't correspond to the real needs of children. So I'm very firmly of the opinion that the battle for socializing kids by parents is a non-negotiable issue.
And yet we see this enormous push to almost enlist the state at this early stage as co-parents, if you like, towards what seems to be a drift in the direction of the state knows best, the nanny state, as many Australians would call it.
Yes, or in Britain we call it the politics of behaviour, where there's an assumption that most parents are too stupid or lack the intellectual resources to know what's in the best interest of their child. And for that reason, you have to bring in all these other people to give their opinion. And what that simply forgets is that for thousands of years, people, ordinary people without any education, almost intuitively understood what their children needs. Most parents, 99.9% of them, act with the best possible intentions. And it seems to me that if you disrupt that relationship between a child and a parent, you don't just simply disrupt it temporarily, you undermine that organic dynamic that you need to have for the sake of the child developing in a mature, independent way. And that's what I'm really worried about with the present trends.
I think I read somewhere that you'd said something to the effect that the greatest mistake the West has made is to deconstruct its families.
I didn't actually say that precisely, but I do think that we've become very uncomfortable with the family. I know that families have a lot of problems, that even if you're well off, sometimes you struggle. Relationships are often facing all kinds of challenges. But at the end of the day, the family is the only unit that we have that can effectively bring children up. More importantly, the only unit that we have that can take responsibility for the long-term future of a child, which is why we see so often when children are taken into care, children are taken into homes, even when the people that look after them have the best of intentions, they're not able to assume the same kind of responsibility. They're not in a position to guarantee the welfare of that child in the long run than a mother or a father whose commitment is for life.
So, just to tease that out in a slightly Australian context, you come here often, you know the country amazingly well. You obviously have an affection for Australia. I sometimes say of Australia, we're of the West, but we're not in it. In many ways, we're one of the youngest of the Western countries, we're least encumbered by debt, we probably have some of the best prospects of any country in the West. But if our future is our children, how do you feel about these trends that you're talking about playing out in Australia?
Well, I see some very important battles ahead. I think one of the nice things about Australia is there is a certain basic fundamental decency that you detect just by interacting with people on the street. You know, when I have conversations with the people that I bump into, I'm very often astonished by the kind of strong sense of character and optimism that they project. I understand that there are other kind of Australians as well. Not everybody has that kind of robust, resilient attitude towards the future that many ordinary Australians have. But what I'm concerned about is that at the moment in Australia, you know, you have a situation where on the one hand, unlike in many other Western societies, you still got that fairly resilient attitude towards the future, this capacity and a desire to make things happen. But at the same time, we also have a kind of cultural elite or cultural oligarchy who's very contemptuous of the ordinary Australian, which I often detect, especially when I talk to some of my academic colleagues. They always talk about the other Australia as this alien territory, where you got these natives who have all these apparent prejudices and who for some reason are not prepared to sign up to their way of life. And I think what worries me is that their influence, if it remains unchecked, can create potentially quite an unhealthy dynamic. Because unless the ordinary people of Australia get a bit more confident voice in the public domain, in the political domain, people that actually are organically linked to them and be able to express their views and sentiments, we may have some trouble in the future.
Jennifer Oriel, it's great to have you here participating in a conversation. I think people are going to be very interested in what you have to say.
Thank you.
You grew up in Adelaide but then moved to academia in Melbourne?
Yes, that's right. I studied in Adelaide, undergraduate years, and then I did my honours degree and PhD in Melbourne. And I moved because at the time I was fairly radical and I was looking for an intellectual community where I could learn more about the ideas. I thought if I were going to be in politics, that I needed to understand the full spectrum of ideas of the side of politics that I was on, and at that stage it was the left side of politics.
That's interesting. I sometimes think that it's hard as we go about our everyday lives to stop and focus on something that I think history tells us, which is that every society, including ours, is the result really of great ideas and often of the great clash of ideas, and that they move over time. So ideas are important to the society that we live in and the shape it takes.
Absolutely, and I think at the time, you know, we've discussed how I was on the left, and at the time those ideas were really born of, my father was working class, he grew up in a very poor single parent household, and he really struggled to get a decent education in Scotland at the time, in Glasgow. And so even though he was conservative culturally, he always remembered that poverty and the difficulty of that poverty, and how much it was an impediment for many people to realise their full potential. And so for me, being on the left side of politics meant working with people who were very disadvantaged and being able to create a better society where they would be given the opportunity, equal opportunity to achieve, and not have to have the impediments that my forebears had in Scotland.
I spoke recently with Melanie Phillips in the United Kingdom, and she tells a very interesting story of growing up in a very tough working class environment, and saying that for her, the Labor Party and the left were her natural home because they looked after the interests of the poor and, as she puts it, defended family vigorously, but over time she found, she would say, she didn't move, but the left did. Was that your experience?
Yes, I mean, my earliest interests were the pursuit of truth and the equal treatment of people. And so for me, that is really what I thought the left represented. And for a time, I think it did. I mean, there were flaws in the approach and serious flaws. But there was this basis of helping the poor and creating strong community because that was the basis of grassroots activism that would change the system wherever that system was unfair or created structural disadvantage for people. And by the time I was in my late 20s, I started to see, after having spent a long time on the left, I started to see that the left was really moving away from truth. I thought that it wasn't allowing the truth even about biological facts to be told, that it had really rejected the Marxist concept of a scientific society. It wasn't really supportive of the scientific method in the humanities where I was working. And this desire to help the poor and work at the grassroots and really work with community had been replaced by a kind of elitism and a very cheap identity or minority politics whose central aim was really to suppress dissenting thought. And that rejection of truth, the rejection of public reason, the rejection of the scientific method revolted me to the degree that I started to move to the right of the line. And no one was more surprised than me with that change in direction.
But to revert back to this thing you raised of identity politics, one of my guests, Peter Baldwin, a very thoughtful Australian, who was would have identified, and I accept your point about not wanting to use those old labels, they're largely out of date, but he would have described himself as a member of a sort of proud left. I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth. And his goals, I think, as a member of the left, I've always seen as noble, even if I vehemently disagreed with how the left wanted to get there. But he would have said, and he did say in one of these conversations, that there was, when he was a left-wing member of the Labor Party in Australia, his goal was universalism. So if you've got marginalised people, if you've got people who are doing it tough or not being treated fairly, the idea is to elevate them up into family Australia,
yes,
into the community. But now, in the name of identity politics, we're sort of creating a new aristocracy, usually based on victimhood. Even if the person doesn't see themselves as a victim, they're painted as victims. And so instead of universalism, we're almost creating, in the name of identity politics, a new set of aristocratic groupings who have to be accorded, special attention.
Yeah. So
how do we understand identity politics a bit better?
Yeah. I think there's two dimensions packed into your question there. That's exactly right about the left. I mean, one thing is that the older left tradition has been universalistic, that we're all human beings, we all have the same fundamental values, we want to live a good, meaningful life. And then the question socially is, how do we make it possible? What's the cultural and political infrastructure going to be so that all human beings can live the best human life? And then left and right and so forth have a different set of values at some level, but also a different understanding of what institutions are going to get people there. That was largely abandoned in the 1960s in the left for philosophical reasons, that they stopped believing that there is a single human nature, right? That there are human natures, plural, constructed by different groups. And so what we have to understand is men and women to some extent are different, the races are different, the ethnicities are different, and so forth. And getting away from that Marxist, as a key example, that the workers of the world are united in their humanity and they have one set of economic interests that need to be realized. The left became much more plural, and a certain kind of multiculturalism then came out of that. So that's one issue. Now, the other issue that is, comes to the victim issue here, is are we trying to raise those who we think are dispossessed or underprivileged or in a weaker position to what we take to be the normal Australian or Western or human standing? Or do we have another agenda at work? And this is a very interesting thing about the history of left. And I think there are different species of leftists here. Are you more interested genuinely in helping the poor and the weak and the dispossessed get better? Or are you really interested in bringing down the rich and the powerful? So are you animated more by destruction and resentment and envy? And that has been a powerful left tradition. Or are you actually motivated by compassion for the underprivileged? So I think what has happened here is that the left has gone through various metamorphoses. In the first century and a half or so of modern leftism, you had both sides. I mean, even John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Nietzsche, both of whom were critical of the left, were going out of their way to say, if you really want to know what hatred and envy and resentment look like, look at the far leftists. And that's back in the 19th century. But at the same time, to be fair to the left, there are any number of them, George Orwell and others among them, who have been genuinely motivated by poverty is not the normal human condition, and damn it, we should be able to solve this as a society. So I think both of those motivations are there. What I think, though, has happened in the modern left, and I'm much less sympathetic to leftists of the last half century or so, is that the left has widely come around to agree that, look, they used to think that socialism was going to outstrip capitalism in productivity, and that capitalism is ultimately going to generate poverty and despair and immiseration. And they just had to abandon that argument because, you know, free market capitalism, if anyone has a shred of intellectual honesty about them, has been the greatest boon to human beings ever. Lifting billions of people out of poverty, extending lifestyles, and so forth. There is no debate. I don't think there's actually any honest debate that if you want to have economic prosperity, you need to have some sort of a market economy. And even the far left has recognized that. So the leftists who are then in a position of genuinely being motivated, I want to raise the poor out of poverty. The honest thing then for them to do is to say, all right, I have to convert to some sort of market liberalism. And a significant number of them did. They repackaged themselves as centrists. Some went over to capitalism and so forth. But what you're then left with, though, is the resenters, the ones who are not actually motivated by that. What they are interested in is, I don't know, for whatever reason, I just hate rich people. Right? I hate powerful people. And I don't want to get too psychological in this because you have to know someone very well to make these sorts of accusations. But I do know a certain number of people personally, and you see this in the writings of the leftists when they are writing more autobiographically about what motivates them. And a lot of it is not sympathy for the poor, it's just hatred, resentment, and envy for those who they think are doing a lot better. And they just get a pleasure out of seeing those people brought down a peg. So the resentment left and so forth, I think is a powerful animating force. From their perspective, the people who are on the losing end of various cultural battles, who are dispossessed, right, and so forth, I think they are just being used tactically as pawns. That's not what's really going on.
Two interviews being posted now are from highly intelligent men from different ends of the political spectrum in Australia. Peter Baldwin served in the Hawke Labor government, and Tony Abbott, of course, is extremely well known in more recent times as a former Prime Minister and thinker at large. Both men are people that I respect greatly. They have a different perspective on good policy, but both have a deep commitment to improving Australia and the society we live in according to the way they see the world. More importantly, what emerges from these two talks, I think, is that they both respect and understand the need for debate, perhaps robust, but debate. Debate that is respectful, that can be vigorous, but which focuses on the issues, not on the personalities. I hope you'll find them both interesting. I suggest that looking at one would necessitate looking at the other. Peter, welcome to a conversation about modern Australia. You and I think, you were in the Parliament for a long time. We overlapped. You were a very senior minister on the other side of the political divide to me. We now, though, find, I think it's fair to say, a great deal more we have in common as Australians than we have to separate us and to differentiate us. I think that's important because it seems to me today that we focus on things that divide us all the time, not things that pull us together. You are a man of serious intellect. You write a lot. You've been writing a lot about freedom of speech, about the changing nature of left-wing politics, about the need for people not to reject their culture but to build on it, lest they lose their cultural and economic strength and are not able to serve their own people and indeed other people in the world well. Can I ask you firstly how you think politics on the left has changed, and in particular this modern thing that people talk about, identity politics? What does it mean?
Yeah, so the thing that disturbs me about the way the left's gone in recent times is the embrace of so-called identity politics. Now, the essence of identity, the left used to be fully on board with the Enlightenment conception of a common humanity, that what the important thing about us that unites us with people of different races, genders, creeds, etc., was that we're part of the same humanity. Identity politics basically contends that we are first and foremost a member of one or other categories based either on race or gender or sexual orientation or whatever.
So it emphasises our differences rather than the things we have in common.
Yes, it basically, you see contributions from people who've embraced the identity politics mindset where they say, prefix everything with something like, as a black, I think this, or as a gay, I think this, or as a Muslim, I think this, rather than, and that sort of way of thinking about yourself is the essence of it. And I think it's profoundly retrograde. It's interesting that as recently as 1992, the old Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote a series of major histories of the Western world, gave a speech where he said, what is this identity politics? This has nothing to do with the left. The left is about common humanity and improving the lot of a common humanity. It's not about looking at this or that particular identity group. And I just see it as profoundly retrograde. And one of the most objectionable things about it is that if you're a member of an identity group, well, identity groups come in two categories. There are those that are oppressed and those that are oppressor. So if you're a white male, well, of course, you're part of an oppressor group. I mean, you might be impoverished and a person with very little power or influence whatsoever, but that white skin marks you out, yes, as somebody who is inherently privileged. And another aspect of it is that you're expected to stick to a script that relates to your identity group. So, for example, and somebody who departs from the script is a sort of a traitor. Sarah Haider, who I mentioned when we were discussing earlier, is a young American of Pakistani Muslim background who defected from the Islamic religion and got involved in setting up a group called the Ex-Muslims of North America. She said in a very interesting speech to the American Humanist Association that after she defected, she expected hostility from Islamic groups, but she got equal hostility from left-wing groups who attached labels to her like Uncle Tom, House Muslim, native informant. So what that in effect says is she's not a human being with rationality and agency and the ability to make judgments about the cultural milieu into which she's born. She's a Muslim, and she must stick to that identity. And to fail to do that is tantamount to a kind of treason. Now, there's a sense in which, I think this is, you could almost say this is a racist mentality. I found that profoundly objectionable.
It's interesting, there's all sorts of things to unpack in that. I just make the observation that when I went to Canberra as a young man, I often found myself in quite deep sympathy with people at the left end of the Labor Party because of their concern for the worth and dignity of individuals wherever they fitted into the socio-economic sort of class in the country. The debate was a bit more simple in those days, I suppose. And as a conservative, I feel that the very basis of our freedom is that old saying, Jack's as good as his master, or Jack's as good as his mate. We all need to recognise one another's worth and dignity. And now that seems to be lost in the idea that we need to elevate some people who have been victims. Would you elaborate on what I'm really putting there, which is the idea that this sort of identity politics feeds into the idea of victimhood? So you have people who are not able to get ahead because they are the victims of the system or of prejudice in the broader society or whatever. And what seems to me to be almost the impossibility today of addressing victims' concerns and redressing their victimhood.
Yes, well, one of the problems with all this is that there's very little emphasis on actually achieving a result for the people who are victimised. I mean, the classic illustration of that is the Black Lives Matter movement in America, which is supposedly about, preserving black lives. What they've in fact achieved is a situation where the police in America are so intimidated that they're reluctant to carry out the kind of proactive law enforcement, looking for people who seem to be doing something potentially dangerous, so we're going out and actively questioning people and so forth, and the approach to policing, which has been so effective in bringing down homicide rates and other crime rates over a period of decades. That's all gone into reverse. Cops are so terrified of, and this is confirmed by law enforcement officials in America and also, but the statistical evidence on what's happened to crime rates is really quite stunning. It's just that long-term decline has gone into sharp reverse, and especially in inner urban areas. There's an increase, the total number increase in homicides over a period of a year, it was something like 900 in total. And so in other words, a movement that was supposedly about protecting black lives, by disempowering the police, who are the only thing that stands between people living in these ghettos and uncontrolled gang violence, by disempowering the police, they've greatly increased the risk of them falling victim to gang-related violence. In other words, it's been completely counterproductive. But that's not of no concern to those who promulgate identity politics. It just doesn't figure.
Well, that actually makes it easier for them to continue to run their own narrative. You don't want the problem solved.
No. There's somebody made an interesting analogy once that social justice warriors, in this sense, no more want to eliminate the problem, whether it be it poverty or violence, than the lions want to eliminate the herds of antelope and impalas on the African steppe. I think there's something in that. The left used to say, let's get past the things that divide us. Martin Luther King expressed it perfectly in his great civil rights speech in 1963, where he said he looked forward to the day when his children would be judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. But
brilliant
now,
words.
racial distinctions have to be perpetuated. The sense of grievance and victimhood has to be perpetuated. White people with that dreaded white skin, are supposed to permanently have a sense of guilt about things that they may or may not have had anything to do with. It's just pernicious stuff. And we're starting, you know, eventually you get a reaction to it. And in America, the Democratic Party has discovered to its cost, if you keep deprecating people, calling them deplorables and so forth, well, they might decide to spit in your eye. And hence we have President Donald J. Trump, which I don't think was the result that the Democratic Party was interested in achieving.